Sometimes the most profound moments arrive without warning, slipping into our lives during the most ordinary circumstances. What began as a simple act of kindness became something that awakened feelings I'd forgotten I was capable of experiencing. A single evening that reminded me how much life still had to offer. But first, I'm curious. Where are you reading this from? I find it remarkable how stories can travel across distances, reaching people in their own unique spaces around the world. The clock showed nearly 11 p.m. when the small party at my cousin Margaret's home started winding down. I hadn't intended to stay so late, but the evening had been filled with genuine warmth, the kind of laughter and conversation that feels like medicine for the soul. At 58, I don't venture out much anymore. My days have settled into predictable rhythms. But Margaret had been persistent about my attendance, and I was grateful she'd convinced me. It was during these final moments that I encountered Thomas. He wasn't related to us, just a longtime friend of Margaret's younger brother, Mark. They'd maintained their friendship since their university days, though Thomas appeared to be several years Mark's senior. Striking in his height with confident shoulders and a gentle smile that softened his angular face, he possessed a quiet self-assurance that was immediately noticeable. When Margaret had introduced us hours earlier, our conversation had been pleasantly mundane. Comments about the unseasonably mild weather, recent travels, the new construction downtown. Yet something in his measured, thoughtful way of speaking made me find myself listening more intently than usual. As guests began their departures, I noticed Thomas near the entryway, phone in hand, his brow creased with concern. I was reaching for my jacket when Margaret casually mentioned that Thomas had been having car troubles throughout the evening. She gave me that knowing look that only family members can master, part suggestion, part gentle coercion, and remarked, "Your neighborhood is close to his, isn't it? Perhaps you could offer him a ride?" I paused briefly, not from reluctance, but because it had been quite some time since I'd driven a stranger home after dark. The route was convenient enough, and Thomas responded with a gracious, warm smile. "Only if it wouldn't be an inconvenience," he said, his voice carrying that same measured kindness. The evening air held a sharp clarity as we walked outside, our exhaled breaths creating small wisps in the glow of the street lighting. My vehicle was parked down the block, and our synchronized footsteps against the pavement provided the only soundtrack to the peaceful night. I was aware of him maintaining a respectful distance beside me, close enough for easy conversation, far enough to avoid presumption. Once seated inside, the world seemed to contract around us. The engine's gentle purr filled the interior as the dashboard's soft illumination highlighted the strong line of his profile and the subtle upturn at the corner of his mouth. He carried a faint scent of sandalwood mixed with something else I couldn't identify, something comforting and homely. Our route took us through mostly deserted streets, the type where streetlights create rhythmic pools of brightness, casting moving shadows across the windshield like a visual metronome. We discovered ourselves talking more freely than I'd anticipated, discussing favorite artists, marveling at time's swift passage, sharing amusing memories from decades past. He possessed an attentiveness that made every word feel valued and heard. Paused at a traffic signal, I glanced sideways and found him studying me. Not intrusively, but with that quiet, perceptive attention that makes you suddenly conscious of your own presence. An unfamiliar flutter stirred in my chest, a sensation I hadn't experienced in countless years. I redirected my gaze quickly, pretending to examine the dashboard clock. We continued onto a narrow avenue bordered by leafless winter trees. The street felt suspended in stillness, and I reduced our speed as we neared his area. That's when the moment unfolded. He adjusted his position slightly in the passenger seat. Then his hand moved across the space between us, tentative initially, before settling gently over mine where it rested on the gear selector. The gesture wasn't impulsive. It wasn't presumptuous. It was intentional, a wordless inquiry expressed through contact. His hand felt warm and sure, somehow making the winter chill outside seem distant and irrelevant. For several heartbeats, I remained motionless. My attention stayed fixed on the road ahead, but my thoughts suddenly surged with questions. Why did this connection feel so right? Why did it seem as though I'd been unconsciously waiting for exactly this kind of human touch? I could sense my pulse accelerating, not with anxiety, but with a quiet anticipation I was reluctant to acknowledge. I made no attempt to withdraw my hand. Instead, I allowed it to remain beneath his, letting that simple contact communicate what words couldn't express in that moment. The remainder of our journey passed in a haze. The passing lights, the sleeping houses, the engine's steady hum all fading into insignificance. When I eventually stopped outside his residence, he didn't immediately break the contact. He turned toward me, his expression both mysterious and open, as if waiting to see whether I might speak first. I remained silent, my voice seemingly trapped between my heart and throat. He gave my hand the gentlest pressure before releasing it, thanking me quietly for the transportation. But as he disappeared into the cold darkness, I recognized that something fundamental had altered, not just in the atmosphere between us, but within me as well. Dawn arrived earlier than my usual routine the following morning, though I couldn't pinpoint why. Perhaps from habit, or perhaps from the persistent echo of the previous evening, his hand covering mine, the warmth of it still resonating somewhere deep in my chest. I prepared my morning coffee and positioned myself by the kitchen window, observing as pale winter sunlight gradually spread across the backyard. Everything appeared normal, yet internally, nothing felt unchanged. I attempted to rationalize the experience. Physical contact happens constantly between people. A simple gesture didn't necessarily carry deeper significance beyond its immediate context, but I could still visualize his eyes in the dim automotive lighting, the way he hadn't rushed to break our connection. It hadn't been accidental. It possessed weight, and that weight remained with me still. By mid-morning, I'd immersed myself in household tasks, washing clothes, organizing the living space, preparing a shopping list. Yet my mind consistently wandered back to him. When my phone chimed on the kitchen counter, I answered without hesitation. A message from Margaret appeared. Thomas just contacted me to express his gratitude for last night's ride. He mentioned you're very easy to converse with. I stared at the screen longer than necessary before typing a brief response. Happy to assist. He seems like a good person. I nearly added more but restrained myself. An hour passed before another notification, this time from an unfamiliar number. Hello, this is Thomas. I hope I'm not overstepping. Simply wanted to thank you once more for yesterday evening. I genuinely enjoyed our conversation. My thumb hovered uncertainly over the keypad. I could have responded with something brief and polite, but instead typed, I enjoyed talking with you as well. You made the drive much more pleasant. I hesitated momentarily before sending. What developed wasn't a constant stream of messages, but a gradual, steady dialogue throughout the day. A remark about the changing weather, an inquiry about a novel I'd referenced, a brief anecdote about his vehicle's continued refusal to start that morning, and his subsequent bus trip downtown. The exchange felt natural and innocent, yet an underlying current existed, something warm and unspoken. By late afternoon, he inquired, would it be appropriate if I visited tomorrow to bring you something? Just a small gesture of appreciation. I didn't require anything from him, and I almost declined. But some part of me, perhaps the part that had been dormant for years, wanted to see him again. Certainly, I responded, my heart beating slightly, faster as I sent the reply. That evening, I reminded myself to maintain appropriate boundaries, to remember he was Margaret's connection, that this represented nothing more than two individuals sharing a brief moment. But when I recalled the way he'd observed me in the car, I knew I was deceiving myself. The following day arrived with overcast skies and the scent of approaching precipitation. Around 2:30 in the afternoon, I heard knocking at my front door. Opening it revealed him standing there, tall, shoulders lightly moistened by the drizzle, carrying a small bakery bag. I brought some baked goods, he said, displaying that calm, deliberate smile. From that shop you mentioned. I stepped aside to welcome him inside, the house's warmth enveloping us both. As he handed me the package, our fingertips made contact. Not accidental, not entirely purposeful either, but sufficient to recreate that same spark I'd felt during our car ride. We settled at my kitchen table while gentle rain tapped against the window glass, discussing everything and nothing simultaneously. His voice filled the room comfortably, and I found myself laughing more frequently than I had in recent memory. There was no urgency, no discomfort, just an ease I hadn't anticipated. At one moment, I reached for my coffee cup, just as he did the same. Our hands touched again, and this time neither of us immediately withdrew. His gaze met mine, steady and searching, and in that wordless instant, I understood. Whatever this was becoming, it would transform something fundamental in my existence. Rainfall continued steadily that afternoon, creating an unhurried rhythm that obscured the view beyond my kitchen window and made the external world seem remote. Inside, however, the atmosphere felt charged, almost electric, as Thomas relaxed in his chair, his hand remaining close enough to mine that I could sense the quiet magnetism of his presence. Our initial conversation covered familiar territory. Destinations we'd visited, cuisines we enjoyed, how the community had evolved through the years. But somewhere between refilling our mugs and finishing the final pastry, our dialogue deepened. He asked about my life, not surface details, but the kind of questions people pose only when they genuinely care about the response. I found myself sharing things I rarely discussed. I spoke about the years following my marriage's end, how I'd concentrated so intensely on maintaining stability that I'd stopped recognizing how much I'd stopped truly living. I described my modest routines, the peaceful days, the occasional family events that were pleasant but never particularly memorable. He listened without interruption, his attention unwavering, his expression receptive as though every word held meaning. When I eventually inquired about his experiences, he smiled thoughtfully and replied, "I suppose I've been relocating so frequently that I never remained anywhere long enough to establish real connections." He shared stories of positions in various cities, relationships formed and lost during transitions, and the subtle isolation of beginning anew more times than he preferred to remember. A pause followed. Not an empty silence, but one filled with unspoken understanding. His eyes held mine, and I felt the significance of it, as though he was searching for something within me, or perhaps offering something he couldn't quite articulate. Distant thunder rumbled softly, and instinctively, I glanced at the clock. Nearly an hour had elapsed since his arrival, though it seemed like moments. "I should probably leave before it gets too late," he said, but his voice carried no urgency. He didn't move immediately, and neither did I. When he finally stood, I accompanied him to the door. The rain had softened to a light mist, the kind that makes the air smell fresh and renewed. He stepped onto the porch, then turned back toward me. "Thank you," he said, his tone gentler now. "Not just for the transportation the other night or today, but for making me feel like I could stop wandering for a while." Something tightened in my chest at those words. I couldn't find an appropriate response, so I simply nodded, my fingers loosely gripping the door's edge. Then, before departing, his hand reached for mine again, slow, deliberate, just as in the vehicle. This time, however, it lingered. His thumb traced gently across my skin, and time seemed suspended. I could feel his warmth, his steadiness, the quiet commitment in the way he held my hand. Despite the dampening drizzle, I felt only comfort. When he eventually released my hand, he didn't immediately say farewell. He simply regarded me for another moment, as though more words existed that he wanted to express but couldn't. Not yet. Closed the door after his departure, leaning against it briefly as the soft sound of his footsteps disappeared down the walkway. My hand still tingled where he'd held it, and I realized I was smiling, subtly, but enough to feel it in my expression. That night. I lay listening to the rain against the rooftop, my thoughts returning to him repeatedly. Something was developing, gradually, quietly, but undeniably. For the first time in years, I found myself wondering where this path might lead if I allowed myself to follow it. The rain had cleared by morning, leaving the air cleansed and cool. Sunlight poured through my curtains in long golden bands, and for a moment I simply rested there, absorbing the warmth. I didn't know whether I'd hear from Thomas that day, but thoughts of him wove through everything I did, preparing coffee, folding laundry, even standing at the sink, watching light play across the kitchen counter. It was nearly midday when my phone buzzed. Seeing his name on the screen made my breath catch slightly. "Are you available this afternoon?" I thought perhaps we could take a walk, enjoy the fresh air after all that rain. I studied the message, smiling unconsciously. My life had been constructed around quiet routines for so long that something as simple as an unplanned outing felt like an expedition. We arranged to meet at the small park on the town's outskirts. The ground remained damp, and leaves overhead occasionally dripped, but the pathways were clear. He was waiting when I arrived, hands tucked in his jacket pockets, wearing that same comfortable smile. "I wasn't certain you'd agree," he said, matching my pace as we began down the trail. "I wasn't certain either," I confessed, and he chuckled, softly. The park was nearly deserted except for birdsongs and the gentle squelch of our footsteps against the path. We discussed topics that don't surface in group conversations: the music that defined our teenage years, the individuals who had influenced us, the decisions we'd made and those we still questioned. Occasionally, our hands would brush as we walked, and each contact sent that familiar quiet tremor through me, the same one I'd experienced during our first car ride. Midway around the trail, we paused at a small wooden bridge overlooking a creek. The water flowed peacefully, capturing sunlight in fleeting sparkles. He leaned against the railing, gazing out, then looked at me. "You know," he said slowly, "I didn't anticipate meeting someone like you. Not now. Not here." My heart rate increased, slightly. "What do you mean, like me?" "Someone who makes me want to remain in one place," he replied, his voice quiet but confident. The words suspended between us, and momentarily I questioned whether I could trust my voice enough to reply. I had spent countless years convincing myself that such connections belonged to a previous chapter of my life. But standing there with him, I realized I might have been mistaken. He reached for my hand again, no hesitation this time, and I accepted it. The warmth of his fingers intertwined with mine, steady and certain. We remained like that for a while, simply observing the water, the surrounding quiet making the moment feel even more authentic. When we resumed walking, neither of us released the other's hand. We spoke less now, but the silence wasn't uncomfortable. It was the kind that feels secure, where words aren't necessary to fill the space. Back at the parking area, he stopped before we reached my car. "I don't understand what this is yet," he said, "but I'd like to discover it with you." There was no pressure in his tone, no urgency, just honesty. I realized I wanted that too. I squeezed his hand, meeting his gaze. "Then let's see where it leads." When we said goodbye, I watched him walk away, sunlight catching in his hair. It wasn't a dramatic, cinematic conclusion, just two people parting with the quiet certainty that they would meet again. Driving home, I felt somehow lighter, as though a door had opened in a room I hadn't realized had been sealed for years. Whatever lay ahead, I knew one thing with certainty. Sometimes the most unexpected connections are the ones that remind you how much life you still have left to live.